To find out what football legends would make up the ultimate 2000s fantasy team, we're joined by NFL.com senior fantasy editor Michael Fabiano, who's going to talk about this subject here, and Sean Merriman, who has played with and against some of the people we're going to talk about here. But Fabs, quickly, just kind of tell us what this whole concept is.
Well, basically, it is for the entire decade. Who had the most fantasy points during the entire decade? And then when we look and compare against last season, what was the best season in the decade that those players had?
All right, well, let's start with quarterback. Who would that quarterback be?
Familiar name, Peyton Manning of the Indianapolis Colts back then. Peyton was the #1 quarterback in fantasy football for the decade. Most passing yards, most passing touchdowns. So the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Well, Peyton Manning, where would he rank in today's fantasy?
Well, his 2004 season was the best of the decade. That's when he broke Dan Marino's record, 49 touchdown passes. I was actually with Dan Marino at the CBS Green Room when it happened. He was very gracious. But Peyton had 362 fantasy points, and the only player last year that would have scored more fantasy points is Peyton Manning, who had 55 touchdown passes.
All right, let's move on to running back.
A couple of very familiar names. First of all, LaDainian Tomlinson, who arguably is the best running back in fantasy football history, although Marshall Faulk is right there as well. LaDainian, #1 in rushing yards, scrimmage yards, rushing touchdowns, and scrimmage touchdowns. The man was an absolute fantasy football dream. He was the first pick overall in just about every single draft for most of that decade. And #2, Edgerrin James of the Indianapolis Colts. Edge came out of Miami and played extremely well as a rookie, and then just continued to pile up big numbers, and his quarterback was Peyton Manning. Edgerrin, 2nd in rushing yards and scrimmage yards, 5th in rushing touchdowns and scrimmage touchdowns.
Well, speaking of LT, I played with LT, and even though it wasn't that long ago, where would he rank in today's fantasy?
Oh, numero uno, without a question. In 2006, LaDainian Tomlinson had the best fantasy season of all time. Almost 430 fantasy points. That's over 100 more points than Jamal Charles had last year. And he had a great season. Edgerrin James would have also finished #1. Of course, #2 to LaDainian Tomlinson, his 2000 season, almost 340 fantasy points. I miss those days when the featured backs were the guys who saw the football each and every snap, like LT and Edgerrin James. There's very few of those guys now in the National Football League.
Yeah, I could have used one of those on my fantasy football team last year. All right, let's move on to wide receiver, Fast.
Again, a couple of names you're going to be very familiar with. #1, Randy Moss. Randy Moss was phenomenal. One of the best wide receivers of that decade. Maybe a Hall of Famer, guys. He was just unbelievable when it came to fantasy football. 2nd in receiving yards, 1st in receiving touchdowns for the decade. Of course, his numbers could have been even better had it not been for those 2 years in Oakland where he really didn't produce very good numbers. And then, of course, Terrell Owens. Terrell Owens played for 4 different teams, San Francisco, Philadelphia, with Dallas, and also with the Buffalo Bills. 3rd in receiving yards, 2nd in touchdown catches for the decade.
And even though these guys probably could still play today at their old age, what would they be ranking at today?
Randy Moss would have been #1 compared to last year. 2013, it was Josh Gordon who was #1, but Moss, 287 fantasy points in 2007, which is the year he broke the record for touchdown catches that was previously set by Jerry Rice. And #2, Terrell Owens, who would have also been #1, 2001, playing with Jeff Garcia, who's been on our show quite a bit. He had a very big year for the San Francisco 49ers.
All right, let's move on to tight end.
This one is going to be a surprise to no one, Tony Gonzalez. Tony Gonzalez, who has been one of the best tight ends in the league and in fantasy football throughout his illustrious career between the Kansas City Chiefs and the Atlanta Falcons. #1 in receiving yards, #1 in receiving touchdowns for the decade of the 2000s for Tony Gonzalez. I promise you, he will be missed by fantasy owners in 2014. Despite the fact that he was a little long in the tooth, he was still great.
Now, he might have been missed. He probably still could play. We don't know officially if he's retired or not yet. He said he is, but he can always line back up and play. But what would he rank today?
He would have been right up there at #2, only behind Jimmy Graham. He would have been better than Vernon Davis, Julius Thomas, and Tony Gonzalez in his 2000 season when he had over 1,200 receiving yards and 9 touchdown catches. Great numbers for a tight end.
Boy, it sounds like the guys from a few years ago are better than the guys from just last year, at least based on these fantasy terms.
Right.
Quickly, Fabs, if you had to draft a defense, which one would it be?
The Baltimore Ravens of that era were just phenomenal, and they had some terrific superstars, of course. Ray Lewis, Ed Reed, Tony Siragusa. They had the superstars, and they had the blue-collar guys as well. The Ravens were 2nd in total defense, 5th in sacks, 1st in interceptions, and 1st in takeaways among defenses for the decade.
What do they rank, though?
they would have ranked number 1 if they had played 2013 compared to what they did in 2006. 60 sacks, 60 in that season, 28 picks, 6 touchdowns, and over 250 fantasy points. That's 49 more points than the Chiefs scored last year. And we all know if you had the Chiefs defense, they were just unbelievably productive. So the Ravens defense of 2006, very productive in fantasy terms.
Sean, we hear all this stuff about football analytics. That, sir, was analytics to the max. Michael Fabiano, thanks so much.
Always a pleasure.